Hi guys, my name is Oded, and in this podcast we'll speak about software development in the field of medical device, pharmaceuticals, and healthcare with industry-leading experts. I hope you find this content useful. Let's start. It is such a great pleasure to have Mr. Koen Cobbaert on the podcast for episode number 20. We'll hear about AI regulatory compliance and legislation. Mr. Cobbaert, thank you very much for taking the time to participate.
You're very welcome with that. You can just call me Kuna. No need for formalities here.
Before we dive in, maybe you can share with us a bit about your professional journey.
Sure. So I'm about 47 now. So I worked for about a bit more than 2 decades in medical device space, starting as an application specialist on bone densitometry for a small company that was a spin-off from NASA research into what happens when you send the body into space and the astronauts, we see that they lose muscle mass. Do they also lose bone? And so from that question came forth bone densitometers to measure that in a non-invasive way. So I was mainly training doctors, engineers on the use and the maintenance and the installation of those equipment. I was a sort of specialist that trained engineers and doctors from a rather large area, so Europe, Middle East, including Israel, those parts of Africa where osteoporosis is relevant, and then the western part of Asia. And then that was bought by General Electric, so I worked for a while for General Electric, did a small journey into in vitro diagnostics, working with expert systems. Then for over 13 years, I worked for Agfa Healthcare, working on software for a wide variety of applications. So I was a regulatory and a quality manager. I wrote the technical files. I moderated the risk management meetings, the clinical evaluation meetings. I did regulatory submissions in the EU for the FDA, and then worked with local people across the world to really do submissions for mostly radiology, oncology, orthopedics, and cardiology applications. And then for about 3 years now, I joined Philips, where I'm able to do what I really love and that I have been doing at Agfa before, but now I can do it full time, and that is represent the industry, the medical device industry at the European Commission and the International Medical Device Regulators Forum in various work groups, but the one relevant for this podcast is really the one on medical device software and software as a medical device, on artificial intelligence. So that's what I do on EU level and international level. I also follow or contribute to trade associations in a number of countries, in Belgium, the Netherlands, and also in the UK, because as you may know, after Brexit, the MHRA is working on a post-Brexit medical device regulation, where they have quite ambitious plans in the field of artificial intelligence. And other than that, there's a whole range of standardization bodies that work on artificial intelligence, but also electrical equipment, respirators, and so forth, where I am representing my company as an expert. So I contribute to the creation of standards for our healthcare space. That's in a nutshell my journey and what I do today.
So let's start with what are the challenges for manufacturers when they are wanting to incorporate AI or anything that concerns AI in their medical device?
Yeah, well, it depends a bit on what sort of AI and how you define AI. But if you zoom into just those neural networks, the deep learning and the supervised and unsupervised AI, then it's mostly related to, I would say, market access. So once you have market authorization, so once you have your CE label, your 510Ks, you need to get your tool into the care pathways. And that often means you need to gain trust of the clinicians. You need to prove that it has value. And gaining that trust is often much harder than getting the regulatory approvals. Because the needs are different in the different hospitals for the different users. Because some AI is not very robust, may have been trained on data that is not very representative for the particular practices in a healthcare institution, or may miss. I mean, some types of AI have a distribution curve where the manufacturer may have focused on the predominant cases, really, but there may be a long tail to the distribution curve where you have very uncommon situations that occur where the AI totally misses the ball, where a physician or a clinician will easily identify what is going wrong or what the correct decision should be that the AI should take. So gaining that trust is difficult. If you look at then the challenges in the market authorization, so the CE marking and the 510Ks and the PMAs and the Novo applications for AI, there's really a lack of guidance on what is expected from the side of regulators or notified bodies in terms of evidence. And you feel a certain uncomfort also among notified bodies that are faced with submissions that involve AI. So it would be good to have some sort of a checklist or some sort of guidance that goes a bit more in depth into what sort of evidence is required there. So and if you then zoom into what are the most common findings during these audits or these technical file assessments or 510K submissions, it often, I think, for 95% of the cases, it focuses on the clinical evidence of those applications. So proving that your data is statistically relevant for the intended target population, that the methods that you've used to prove that your device is safe and performant, that those methods are state of the art, are scientifically sound and solid. That's where I see most of the findings relate to. So that's it.
And you said that there's a lack of checklist, but I mean, I assume it's more kind of regulatory guidance from the regulator. Is there something happening in the EU to address those open issues?
Definitely. I mean, not just in the EU, everywhere you see loads of initiatives related to providing guidances or starting to provide guidances on artificial intelligence. Starts at the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, where there is now a work item that is about to finish, really. It relates to providing a glossary for machine learning medical devices. Now, machine learning medical devices, that's a specific type of devices where the learning is in essence needed to achieve the intended purpose. So it's about devices that need to continue to learn on the data of a particular patient or on the data of a particular health institution in order to achieve their intended purpose. For example, you could, if you wanted to, create an expert system that uses some Boolean logic to predict which patients will develop a delirium or sepsis. But we know from testing that you can never achieve the needed performance to make that sort of tool valuable in the care paths. The only way to reach the performance that clinicians will really consider deploying such tools is through further training those devices on the data on the care paths in that particular healthcare institution, because it sometimes boils down to do the nurses wash their hands, or how often do they do their rounds of the patients? How often do they note down the symptoms and so forth, to make a difference between whether the AI is able to predict sepsis in a sufficiently sensitive and precise way or not. And so for that sort of applications, you need machine learning. But you will also see machine learning medical devices in the space of adapting devices to the needs of a specific patient. For example, prostheses that sense the signals of the nerve endings of somebody that lost a limb. If you want to train those prostheses in such a way that the fine motor skills of the hand, of the robotic hand, are good enough to do daily things like picking up a cup of coffee and so forth, it is often needed, or if you want to really reach a performance that the patient is happy with, you could do a lot better with machine learning than with traditional methods. And so that's the sort of devices that, after they left the factory, need to further be trained on specific patients or specific healthcare institutions to reach a performance that is really state of the art and what is expected. So the IMDRF has developed a draft that has been submitted for public consultation, in which they defined machine learning medical devices, but also a range of terms like bias, reliability, continuous learning, and so forth. Those terms are now being discussed at the IMDRF, and ideally will lead to a guidance that will then later be used to develop potentially further work items on machine learning medical devices, for example, relating to the manufacturing of such devices, what is considered good machine learning practices, for example, or when is a device considered to change in a substantial way so that a new regulatory filing is needed. How do you monitor performance of such devices and so forth? So the MDRF is having a discussion at this moment, a reflection on what sort of work items should follow from that, so that there is international convergence when regulators across the world adopt guidance that talks to their specific legislation. And so, for example, in the EU, there's also participation at IMDRF level with the intent to then develop that sort of guidance in the European Union. But in parallel, and I think the EU is not the only one, also the UK is doing something similar, the FDA does something similar, TGA, they do parallel exercises. So there is some reflection at national level. In the EU, that's done through Core MD. Core MD is a consortium where the European Commission participates together with a number of member states, the Netherlands, for example, Ireland, together with professional societies, so the European Society of Cardiologists, the European Society of Orthopedics, and so forth. There's a number of them where they are trying to develop guidance on a number of new technologies, nanomaterials, certain implants, but also artificial intelligence. So the intent is also that there will be guidance that will address various aspects of AI in medical devices there. And then I could continue. For example, China is in my view, from where I'm standing, probably the most advanced in issuing guidance for artificial intelligence, and then not specifically the medical device that continue to learn, but the locked AI systems, so the ones where the algorithms are frozen. They've issued review guidelines to talk specifically to that sort of artificial intelligence to assist the assessors working for the NMPA, so the Chinese medical device authorities, on what to look at when assessing the technical documentation of that sort of devices. And beyond that, there's quite a significant number of standards that the China Medical Device Standardization Association has been developing. Some already in effect, some is still proposal or in draft, but there's definitely very proliferate there at that level.
And the AI Act, is it part of those initiatives that you described? Or?
That's something, yeah, that is something entirely, well, different, but at the same time related. So the Artificial Intelligence Act is a legislation that was proposed not by the unit at the European Commission that is responsible for medical devices, but by the Directorate General for DG Connect, they call it, that deals with more industry-wide aspects. And the AI Act, at least the legislative proposal, so it's not a law yet. It will still be amended by the Parliament and the Council, but the AI Act will cover various sectors, not just the medical device sector, but also, for example, machinery, aviation, toys, also the delivery platforms used by, for example, Deliveroo or Uber, those worker platforms will be affected by the AI Act. And how it does that is it distinguishes artificial intelligence systems that are either high risk or not high risk. And then there's also a category that will be banned. So AI systems that will not be allowed in the EU, such as AI systems for social scoring by public authorities to, for example, use data from your behavior, whether you make your payments and so forth, whether you had any criminal activity and so forth, to decide whether or not your son or daughter is allowed to access university. That sort of AI would be banned in the EU. And then the high risk AI, but again, it's still a proposal, so everything may still change. But what the proposal considers high risk AI systems are systems where there is sectorial legislation in place that requires a third party review or involvement during the conformity assessment. So in other words, if you have a machine or you have a medical device that has an AI system or that is an AI system and a notified body, for example, needs to be involved in the conformity assessment because it has a higher class, well, then that would be considered high risk in the EU. And it's of course maybe interesting to discuss what they consider AI, because there's many definitions being used in this context. But the definition proposed by the European Commission is so broad that it could be read as any software, even traditional software, could be considered an AI system according to the proposal by the Commission. You could wonder why they define it so broad and why did they not zoom into specific technologies. My assumption is that they tried to create legislation that is technology agnostic, that they didn't want to, for example, only zoom into machine learning software that uses neural networks, but that they would also want legislation that applies to, for example, Bayesian networks or support vector systems or whatever sort of software technology that you use to achieve certain purposes. If it is used in a domain that is potentially risky, like the healthcare sector, then they wanted that act to apply to that. That's of course has a huge impact on our sector, because if you define it so broad, AI, well then you could even they would even consider digital thermometers that have a simple Boolean function in their firmware to detect whether the temperature exceeds 38 degrees, and then it would blink a light to say, look, this patient has fever. That sort of very basic software is then apparently AI according to the Commission, and because it's medical device software, it needs a notified body under the MDR. It would then be subject to the AI Act, and that of course created quite a lot of consternation, because the impact of such a broad definition is huge. And we've seen already that the council has started to submit amendments that significantly narrows down what is considered AI. And so the council looks at it from the perspective of we should focus this legislation only on software systems that use either learning or modeling or reasoning without being specifically told how to reach the objectives, the human defined objectives. So it's systems that learn by themselves through reasoning or modeling how to create certain content or predictions. And so that of course, reduces significantly the impact on our sector, but nevertheless, makes it very significant for those companies that work on any reasoning system or any system that uses modeling to achieve its predictions. And so if you want to know what its requirements are, to give you some idea, it's very much taking stock from the requirements that are already in the medical device legislation, because it requires manufacturers to have a quality management system, to perform risk management, to perform post-market monitoring, to do vigilance reporting, to certain record keeping, similar like we know in the medical device legislation. Where it goes a bit more specific is in terms of the data management, the data governance involved in the development of AI systems. So there it's a bit more specific than the medical device legislation. But on other aspects, the medical device legislation is much more specific than the AI Act. So there's a lot of duplication and overlap, and unfortunately also quite a lot of conflicts with certain terms and definitions. For example, importer is defined differently in the AI Act than in the medical device regulation. Importer is no longer simply looking at the legal person that puts a device on the EU market, but it also considers people importers if they simply put an AI system into service, which in practice means if I'm a doctor, I'm a clinician, I download an AI system, an app in other words, from a third country, so from a country outside of the EU, and I put it into service on my own smartphone or on that of my patient without even bringing it on the market, that would be considered an importer. So potentially all our customers are becoming importers under the AI Act, and that's of course very problematic, because importers have all sorts of obligations in terms of verifying compliance, cooperating with authorities, and to achieve some of these obligations, they would need, of course, the technical file of the manufacturer of that medical device, and that's of course contains sensitive information, and that's, if you need to give that to all our customers, that's going to be very problematic. Also in terms of labeling, if you don't quite know who's going to put your systems into service, and that would be highly problematic to coordinate all that. So that's one potential conflict, but there's also requirements that seem to conflict. For example, the AI Act imposes requirements on risk management that at first glance seem to be very similar to the medical device legislation, because it requires us to reduce the risks as low as possible in consideration of state of the art. But it forgets one thing that we have, and that is, I guess, rather typical for the medical device sector. We also are supposed to reduce risk as low as possible for our medical devices, but as low as possible is understood as until the risk-benefit ratio is affected. So that risk-benefit nuance is not there in the AI Act, which could, for certain devices, imply that to meet the AI Act requirements, we would have to reduce the risks further than required under the medical device legislation, to the extent that it starts to affect the performance of those devices, the clinical performance. And then, of course, we may get into trouble under the EU MDR, because we would no longer reach the performance requirements to be able to claim a state of the art, and that could potentially limit the sorts of devices that we have available in the EU market if those conflicts are not resolved during the legislative process. There's other requirements that are talking to, for example, human oversight. So it's the capability of humans of the users to effectively oversee medical devices, and if necessary to interact with the device or to stop the device from, or the AI system from working, or from circumventing the output, for example. Also there, usually we will of course try to do that. Most devices will make sure that the human is in the loop, and often you need the human in the loop to consider that long tail in the distribution curve, where your AI system, like to give a practical example, you can have AIs that detect the manular, so part of the bones in your face, and it may have been trained to recognize those bones and to properly name the bones if the patient is positioned correctly. But sometimes people arrive in the intensive care unit all mangled up by a car accident, and you can no longer put them on the table in a way that is according to the specifications, and then a human will very quickly identify what the manular is, what the mouth of that patient is. But an AI system may totally fail, and then of course you want the human to be able to correct whatever annotation or indications that the user is doing on that system, so that a proper clinical decision can be made. But there are systems out there where a human cannot do that in a way that is effective, and where regulators have actually told us to take the human out of the loop entirely, to make sure that the system reaches a performance level that is state of the art. And to give a few examples, there are studies that have proven that if you and that goes back to my history as application specialist in bone densitometry, if you perform a bone densitometry exam, you really want to follow the bone density of that patient across several years. As the woman enters menopause, you want to see how sharp those drops are, and compare that to reference populations. And this level of precision needed, so you need to position the patient correctly on the table. You need to identify what the different vertebrae are, and studies that looked at the performance of the human together with the software versus the performance of just the software itself came to the conclusion that the software, if you let the software identify where the bone is, where the different vertebrae are, where the intervertebral discs are, will in most cases do a much better job than the humans. It's only in those cases where you have severe anatomic deformities that the software system may need help from humans. In other cases, you want to take the human out of the loop. You want to avoid that they fill around with what is marked as bone and what is marked as soft tissue. Otherwise, you start to have a precision that is no longer acceptable to do that sort of follow-up and to see whether treatment is effective. And there, regulators have told us to take the humans out of the loop and to let the system work by itself. Similarly, in vitro diagnostics, there are software applications out there that detect or that read quantitative PCR curves, for example, for COVID, but also various other diseases, where the FDA has told us to take the human out of the loop, because the AI system takes into account the instructions on the assays. So the assay manufacturers put those assays on the market and tell to the lab that the assay curve has to be read in a certain way. It talks about certain thresholds, but it also talks about the sorts of checks against control fluid and the sort of rules you have to apply to correlate whatever curve there is with the curves that were generated through checks on the control fluids. And to avoid that, labs use less control fluid samples than required by the assay manufacturers. We know that the FDA has told one of those software AI software manufacturers to not allow humans to do the reading themselves. It should be the AI system to avoid that sort of cost reductions. And similarly, there are applications that are in the pipeline or that where researchers have indicated that humans will not be able to perform certain operations with surgical robots that require that the human would need to, if you were to do that, let me make it more specific. If you want to do certain operations on the eye, certain surgery on the eye, in a way that is safe and performant, you should be able to keep in your mind over 100 different parameters on the status of that eye and that patient, and certain sensors that are applied to that eye and to the surgical instruments to do that effectively. And it has to happen in a split second. And as a human, you cannot potentially do that on your own. And that's the sort of operations where researchers point out that this can only be done by a software system that controls these AI systems. And they speculate that it's probably not going to be possible to let a human effectively oversee that operation until after it's really done, because it goes so fast, and it's maybe only a few seconds or maybe not even that the operation takes place. So you can only determine whether it is effective potentially by looking at cohorts of patients after they left the surgery to see if it was effective. And then I foresee that there can be a need to take the human out of the loop, because if they were to intervene in that operation, it's possible that they do more damage than good, and that they could significantly impact the patient outcome there. So the AI Act requires effective human oversight, and it's unclear how you can do that for certain applications. And it also requires, for example, that you have a stop button where for certain systems like the eye surgery, you probably don't want that, or there's a risk that the patient would lose their eye. And so there we start to have conflicts with the medical device legislation. And that's something I hope legislators will iron out before the AI Act is put into place, to make sure that we still have access to the latest state-of-the-art equipment in our healthcare in the EU. There's more, of course, to say on the AI Act. It looks at safety and performance, but it also looks at the fundamental rights. So today, for medical devices, we need to report safety issues, so serious incidents, to authorities. In the future, that will happen through the UDEMET database. The AI Act has similar provisions. It's not clear whether they want us to report the similar or the significant or the serious incidents to UDEMET, whether they will allow us to continue to doing that under the medical device regulation, or whether they, on top of the UDEMET reporting, will require reporting of serious incidents under another database. It's not clear because the text is a bit vague on that, but what we do observe is that the definitions for serious injury or serious incident are different. And we also noticed that they want us to report on breaches of fundamental rights, because that's one of the main reasons the AI Act was drafted. So the fundamental rights, that refers to the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. It contains 50 articles, of which the AI Act tries to address about 1/3 It's fundamental rights on human dignity, for example, the respect for the private and the family life, protection of personal data, freedom of expression and information, freedom of the arts and science, the right of property, the right of the child. And if you look at all these requirements, I guess the ones that are most relevant for our sector is likely related to not being discriminated. So non-discrimination, Article 21 in the Fundamental Rights Charter. And that non-discrimination is often the consequence of bias. Bias because the data that was used for the AI system is biased, or because there were certain ways in which the algorithm was created that introduces bias. And that, this is where the AI Act is actually more specific in terms of how you manage or what good data management practices are than the EU MDR. The EU MDR, of course, has that in its fundaments indirectly, but does not have any specific guidance on how to meet these requirements on reliability and performance, specifically talking to machine learning systems. I guess that's probably the most important fundamental rights issue where we may need to be subject to reporting requirements, and where I see an impact on manufacturers if the Act comes into force. And even if it were not to be applicable to medical devices, because that's something that industry is hoping for, it could still be integrated in medical device legislation, for example, through the harmonization of a particular standard or the issuing of guidance. But that sort of bias aspects will probably force us, because it's suddenly then becoming part of a checklist that a notified body looks at, or that manufacturers look at because it's in a standard, for example, that will force them to apply more scrutiny when they test their systems on the intended patient population. They will need to look for more specifically at, are there really populations here where we don't have enough data, either testing data or training data, to make sure that we can confidently say that it will, for example, also work on just saying something, pregnant women or Asian people, minority populations with rare diseases. If we are not able to cover those, we will probably have to be more specific in narrowing down our intended use or intended populations, or issuing at least cautions on where the confidence, the reliability that we have on of our systems for certain populations is at least that the clinicians are made aware of those potential issues. Another one is environmental protection. That's another fundamental right that may have an impact on our sector, but it's not clear yet to what extent this will come true. Because if you look at our existing definitions for serious incidents and harm under ISO 14971, harm looks at, of course, physical injury, damage to health and property, but also the environment. So the environment is already covered by our risk management standard, but to what extent do we control those environmental risks for AI? There's no guidance on how to do that, and this is an area where further reflection is needed. And we've seen a report for the European Commission that looked specifically at that, because if you want to look at the environmental impact of software or AI systems, you need to look at three different aspects. First of all, it's of course, what sort of computing platform are you using to train your system? Is that powered by green energy, or is there a lot of CO2 emissions there? That's of course something that plays a role. But another aspect is to achieve a certain functionality in your software, you can often program that functionality or train it in various different ways. And one algorithm may be more efficient than another to achieve a certain purpose. And so the way you implement the code could lead to more energy consumption than other alternatives. And of course, running it once will not make a big difference typically, but running it millions and millions of times across the world could make a big difference with an environmental impact that is significant. And then the third layer is the systemic layer. So what's the impact of your AI system on the care paths, the ecosystems in which your system is used, the practices in daily life? And I don't have a good example from healthcare, but I do have several from the non-healthcare sector. If you, in the old days, when we watched a movie, we watched it on TV, or we rented a cassette from the video store. So we walked or we drove to the video store, or some of us took their car, and we rented a few videos. And then I remember you had to bring them back the same week, and so maybe you watched 1 or 2 movies from the video store the same week. Nowadays you have video streaming, and it's much easier to watch a movie. And so of course, watching a movie on video streaming services like Netflix and the other competitors on Netflix, it has less environmental impact than me taking a car to go after a video cassette, some physical thing that has been manufactured and transported to the store. But if you look at what the systemic impact is, you notice that people nowadays watch much more movies than in the 80s and 90s, because the threshold to watch a movie is so much lower. And that, of course, consumes a lot of IT resources, power consumption, and that is rapidly expanding. And that's one of the reasons people think that self-driving cars will also not lead to less cars on the road, but to much more cars than that we know today, because the threshold to take a car becomes so much lower. And so we should also potentially look in healthcare on the sort of application that we put in place, the sort of impact they will have on the environment. And there I don't have good examples, except maybe one. You nowadays start to see these clinical decision support systems that are learning from data within hospital networks, and it's typically used to provide personalized medicine to, for example, patients that have cancer, where the traditional treatments have been used, and the clinicians are discussing with the patient the possibility for proton therapy or some novel therapy that is just made available, where the patient is wondering, of course, well, is it worth it to subject my body to proton therapy and potentially have all sorts of side effects? Or should I use the last remaining 6 months of my life to spend time with my family? And so to give patients that sort of personalized advice with my parameters, my health parameters, and considering the genetic layout of the tumor that I have, and considering the sort of treatments I already had, and seeing that none of them are effective, what's the probability that I will benefit from this treatment? And for those sort of situations, you start to have clinical decision support systems that look at the data of that particular patient and then look into different hospital information systems databases for patients with similar characteristics. And so that sort of system can be locked, but it can also be unlocked because it's really looking for rare diseases and needs to learn on the spot from patients that may be very rare. And so such systems, I mean, the health trainer is one of them. They crawl from hospital network to hospital network with the participating hospital networks across country boundaries to find patients with those characteristics and to make a prediction for that particular patient. Once we start to see that more and more, those sort of personalized medicine, I guess you will have much more use of such systems to make certain predictions, and that of course could have a systemic impact. And there you may wonder, well, how do you assess that really? There's no good standardized methods here to do that yet, and so this is one of the areas where at Sensenelec level. So Sensenelec is the standardization body in the EU responsible to develop standards in support of the AI Act. Ideally, they will look at international standards, but if they are not available, they may develop EU-specific standards. And so this is one of the areas that they're looking into. How do we measure the environmental impact of AI, and how do we do that for these three different levels? And so that's a potential aspect of fundamental rights where we in our sector may also be impacted when we look at impact on the environment of our AI systems. I straddled a bit of it, I think, but feel free to pop the next question.
No, it's absolutely fascinating, and it's really a deep dive into it. I have a few questions regarding the system, the machine learning system that you described, the one that are not freezed, that after they are with the patient, they are continue to be adapting, to learn.
Yeah.
How does this device coincide with the current regulation of design control, change management? Is there big challenges on that front?
Well, depends on the jurisdictions. I understood that it's forbidden in China. I'm not specialized on the Chinese medical device legislation. In the EU, and this is my opinion, I sense some support among certain member states, but there's also equally certain questions being raised there. I think it is possible under the medical device legislation because it's not unique to AI systems or to such machine learning systems that they're changing themselves as they're being used. And I go back to my history as application specialist for DEXA scanners. I mean, these machines, you need to regularly recalibrate them. That's done by the clinician to compensate for the wear and tear of that machine. So sometimes there's mechanical wear, but sometimes the detector loses sensitivity. The X-ray tube starts to have a bit less output because there's some clotting of the X-ray window or some dust or whatever. And so at regular intervals, these systems are recalibrated, which boils down to doing certain tests, checking whether they're still within the performance limits, and sometimes also adjusting certain parameters used in the calculations of, for example, the bone density or the certain signals that are being detected by those devices. And that's not very different for our AI systems. When you release them on the market, they need to be calibrated to the specific care paths in those hospitals or to the data of a specific patient, and then potentially locked. But also at regular intervals, they may need recalibration to, for example, because the practices in that hospital are changing and you want to do some sort of surveillance, monitoring of that performance to ensure that it's still within specs. I think manufacturers will think of similar sorts of tests that we know from the hardware world to accommodate for changes of performance or potential drift or changes of work practices. And that's possible today under the medical device regulation for hardware products. And those hardware products do that by using software that recalibrates and that fills in a new configuration management file. Medical device, machine learning medical devices, in essence, will do that in a similar way. reconfiguring its weights and activation parameters of its model to adapt to a particular situation or changes in the environment in that hospital. And so, legally speaking, I think it's perfectly possible. What we still have to figure out is how to do this in practice. There's no good standards, no good guidances there on how manufacturers should do that, and I think we have to learn a lot from current research in this domain to see if at some point in time we may be able to develop international guidance, and the IMDF has already put it in its work program. It's a draft working program that this is an aspect that they wish to work on. How do you monitor machine learning medical device performance in the real world? But that's in the draft proposal, that's something that they make deal with only in 2027, because the field is very in its infant phase here. And the cases that I know where medical device manufacturers have placed such machine learning medical devices on the market, because they already are on the market, there's very few of them. But the cases that I know, it's done under very, very tight control by the manufacturer. So they release it, and then there's a few weeks that the manufacturer is working together with the hospital to further train it. Of course, they must make sure that the data pipelines, that the way the data is acquired and generated for that machine learning software, that those are really free of bias, that they're properly annotated, the data sets. Certain checks and balances are needed there, and there's nothing really at the moment that we can rely on to guide us there, except our own proprietary information. Of course, it's an area that is also in the focus of IEC SE42, so the standardization bodies working on artificial intelligence. Also there, they're looking at how you at developing standards for data and data governance and good machine learning practices. So help is coming, but it may still take a while, because the output that I see from SC42 is of relative low quality. There's really a lack of AI experts. The best paid ones are working on the applications, and it's really hard to get their time free to look at standardization. And so there's too few experts out there that really have hands-on experience with AI. But we're trying. So we may soon see standards that give us some guidance, hopefully. And that's, of course, always the challenge. You want to do this in a way that accommodates for the different AI technologies, but also in ways that are not too prescriptive, so as not to hinder certain innovations, certain applications, and also not put the bar too low either, because you of course want to assure the safety and the performance of those products. And so finding that sweet spot is really, really key, also in standardization.
Excellent. I wanted also to ask you, software teams, developers, they're basing their life cycle on the development life cycle on IEC 62304, where everything is very clear about how to go about developing the software. The AI, it's also a software, so we have the libraries. We have what life cycle we use for that development. When we use libraries, are they SOUP?
62304 calls itself a lifecycle standard. The meat of that standard really is on software development requirements. So it talks about verification testing, unit testing, how you deal with software of third parties, so-called software of unknown provenance, and how you document what you have to document, and so forth. And it alludes also to, or it requires that you have a quality management and a risk management system into place. Those, of course, relate a bit to risk management. It also talks a bit to modification of software, but it totally misses the validation level. How do you discover? Because that's I think the proper word. We don't program neural networks. The neural networks program themselves through learning from data, and then the validation is not checking against user requirements. We're trying to discover the functionality and the performance of that device, and so that's the validation that's not dealt with by 62304. That's that sort of system level of requirements and validation of those requirements is dealt with by 82304, 60601, so the system level standards. And I think this is where the bulk of the AI specificities related to the life cycle will have to be dealt with, because we will need to look at how you do that monitoring of those systems, how you do the discovery of that sort of functionality, how you manage the risks of those systems, and that's really not dealt with by 62304. 60304, it's what is it? You write down specifications. Sure, we can do that for machine learning components or systems. We can verify them even. We can do unit testing. We can deal with software of unknown provenance. There's nothing really specific on AI that I see is needed in those requirements of 62304. Where we need guidance or where we need changes to our standards is in the level of risk management, potentially, especially to deal with the environmental aspects and the breaches of fundamental rights. How do you deal with that? How do you do the benefit risk ratios if you have to throw fundamental rights into the mix? How do you validate those systems if you don't have user requirements? Well, you may have some high level ones, but the discovery of the functionality, how do you do that? And that's in another standard, of course. Also, how do you provide human oversight to those systems? That's something like there's a report made by AI Watch. That's a unit at the European Commission that looks at the standards available to support the AI Act. And that's an area, human oversight, where they identified there's really not enough detail available in the standards that are currently being developed at horizontal level. And they reason that it's probably because this is so technology or application specific that you can't say anything meaningful at the horizontal level. You need to work this out in the sectoral level. So in the healthcare space, we will probably need to update 82304 specifically to deal with that human oversight aspects. For example, it would have to say things like, what sort of information do you provide to your user so that they become fully aware of or are in control of the machine learning aspects that are needed to reduce bias, to make the device, to adapt it properly to that specific patient. How do you, if there are trade-offs to be made between, for example, precision, sensitivity, or how you deal with that? And that's in 60601, 82304. That's where I would see those AI specificities being dealt with, not in 62304.
Excellent. So you're really saying this stays at the system level, and basically everything that the algorithm does to the neural network or other library that we use, we kind of treat it as a black box. We know it's a library that does neural network, and we test it at the end to make sure with validation, with data set that we know, to make sure that the algorithm, let's say, make the right decision, support the right decisions. But we don't dive into how does code for neural network was programmed, by which vendor, making sure that they had some kind of quality system. We don't touch that.
Well, 62304 deals with those sorts of libraries, if they come from third parties, from a risk management perspective. So it puts the burden on, or the responsibility on, the manufacturer to determine whether they need to go down to the code level there, to determine whether the unit testing and whether the code was written according to certain coding guidelines or not. And if the risk management process tells you that it's important to do those checks, then yeah, you have to go down that path. And that would typically mean have a quality agreement in place with your third-party vendor. And I know for libraries, it's not always that straightforward because they're used for all sorts of purposes. But it could mean, yeah, quality agreement could mean that you have to participate in the design reviews with that library supplier. Could mean you need to ask for potentially sensitive information from an intellectual property point of view, where that library vendor will say, sorry, I'm not giving that to you. You're too small of a customer for us to share that sort of information and to spend time on this. And then, of course, you have no other alternative than to look for another supplier or to develop it yourself. I mean, we've seen that in X-ray systems in the past. We didn't use Windows because Windows 95 was totally unreliable for X-ray systems. A lot of X-ray vendors developed their own operating systems for their X-ray systems because it's way too risky to rely on software where you don't have a view on how the code operates. And so we need to make a similar reflection here, and 62304 gives us some guidance and to justify if it's indeed not risky that we don't have that sort of documentation, but that sort of waiver is not available in legislation. So there's nothing in the MDR or in FDA legislation that gives you that freedom. Sure, they recognize or they have harmonized in the past 62304, but they can always challenge this. You should have the technical documentation needed to prove the performance and the safety of your device. And in some cases, that means you have to go down to the code level. So it depends on the situation and depends on how you use your machine learning software for what purpose.
Excellent. Do you feel that the notified bodies are ready for this AI revolution? Are they adapting, or what do you see on that side? Will they take the industry, or the industry will push them to go further?
It's both ways. They're learning from industry. Industry is also learning from their questions. From my own experience, I noticed that there's just a lack of expertise. Everybody's scrambling for the same resources. They want the AI experts, and that's no different from manufacturers than it is for notified bodies and even competent authorities. They all want the AI experts or the data scientists to ask the content questions, because when I look at regulatory submissions of traditional software, my feeling is they master this. They pose the content questions, but there's a lot of you feel the hesitation. The sort of questions you get from machine learning submissions is that they stay much more on the surface. It's more formalistic, the nature of the questions, than diving into the content, because they are so unfamiliar with this. And so this is an area where we could use guidance, if only to guide them a bit in asking the right questions. And so I have my hope set on the IMDRF to develop this, but also on what is being done at CoreMD. So the consortium with participation of legislators in the EU to provide that sort of guidance, and that could potentially become MDCG guidance. But similarly, we may see further reflections being done by Health Canada, TGA, FDA, with them issuing papers to give a bit more handholds, indicate what sort of considerations are needed, what they expect to see emerge in those submissions. And we've seen that already in various conferences where legislators are speaking that some of them are starting to propose lessons learned from regulatory submissions pertaining to AI. So we start to see a need. We also see that they are participating in standardization, at least some of them. Saudi Arabia is active, FDA is active there, UK is active there. Of course, there can be more participation from elsewhere in the world, but there's a reflection being done at ISO TC 210 and TC 62 in IEC. They both have reflection forums. One is called SNIC, so Software Networks AI Advisory Group, that is looking at our current standardization landscape and giving guidance on where they see needs for further changes or new work item proposals to accommodate our landscape for AI systems. So, yeah, are they ready? Well, it's slowly starting.
And you touched it before, but are you optimistic that there will be harmonization and a consensus standard, or it will still be that for every regulator we have to, and the manufacturer has to go through their specific loops?
Well, at the moment I see it's almost like a turf war. If you look at the standardization bodies, they're as quickly as possibly claiming a certain domain, because then other standardization bodies can't tread on that same domain. So there's a rush to be the first to write a standard on a particular aspect, because then the others can't enter that domain anymore. And that leads to low quality standards at the international level. At national level, because the international level is such low quality, I see that there are initiatives, for example, the Nederlandse veldnorm, the Dutch field norm, to look at clinical evaluations of AI systems. Core MD is going to do something similar. I see that China has done quite a lot in terms of standardization through IEEE, unfortunately, so not international really, and at least not supported by all the countries, but it's in IEEE it's sufficient that a number of experts volunteer to work on something. So there is quite a lot out there, but it's quite a lot is of low quality, and the things that exist are sometimes conflicting, sometimes putting the bar too low or putting the bar too high. One of the things that I'm struggling with is, for example, the training data. Also, the AI Act requires that, at least the proposal, that you provide notified bodies and competent authorities access to training data. And the Chinese standards also require, or the guidelines, they also require training data. And then I raise myself the question, but for what purpose? What do you want to do with the training data? Sure, their hope is, of course, that they will be able to detect from the training data whether it's representative of the target population and whether bias has been minimized. But of course, bias can enter into your application in many more ways than through the training data. It's also how you design your algorithms, how you test your systems, how you design the application, that can impact the performance and whether bias was reduced as low as possible or not. And so to that extent, I think evaluation data, testing data is much more effective to detect bias than looking at training data, because often in training data, you don't have the information needed to detect bias. Because you would need to, for example, collect additional information, for example, on gender, on ethnicity, on socioeconomic factors, data that is often not available in the training data because it was minimized, it was avoided for whatever reason, privacy regulation reason, For testing data, however, you can specifically make sure that you've got the training data sets that have that sort of information to detect whether bias was minimized, not just from the training data bias, but from bias that entered in other ways into your application. And so that's where I see conflicts arise between national guidelines, national standards, even legislative proposals. And of course, it's challenging because you don't want to put the bar too low because safety and performance has to be assured. You don't want to put it too high because then you're gonna stifle innovation, potentially have suboptimal performance in your products. You want to find that sweet spot, and in the beginning of standardization, it's always good to have some form of competition there, to figure out what the best sweet spot is, and then hopefully, of course, because all of this fragmentation brings extra costs, hopefully at some point these standardization bodies and legislators find some common ground to avoid the fragmentation, because that comes at a cost that is ultimately paid for by our healthcare systems and by the patients. And so, I am hopeful by nature that we'll find that common ground, that we have a uniform approach. But today I don't see it.
Well, we'll try to end on an optimistic note, and pray that thing will align at the end. But in a way, you kind of touch it. You say we don't want the bar to be too low. We don't want the bar to be too high. And I'm kind of asking myself, maybe current regulations, they are not specific. Maybe current regulations are sufficient to ensure the goal that we always had for patient safety and efficacy.
That's what I think as well. Yeah, that's what I think as well. I think all the fundamentals are there in our medical device legislation. Sometimes, if you want to look at breaches of fundamental rights, you would need to take the data protection legislations along. For example, the GDPR Article 22 on automated systems required to do an impact assessment to look specifically at fundamental right issues. But if you take both together, you've got it all covered. All the fundamentals are there to make sure that those devices respect fundamental rights, that they're safe, that their performance reach state of the art. It's just a matter of how do you operationalize that? How do you do that in practice? And that layer is something that we are currently working on, and where I have good hopes that we can address this in due time.
Excellent. And I want to say again, thank you very much for going deep on this very important topic for all of us. And maybe you can share how can people follow your publications. I know you've in the past had fantastic trainings.
I guess LinkedIn is the obvious place to hear about any of my initiatives that go public. I do publish a lot, but it's often limited to members of the trade association COSIR, where I have been leading the software focus group for over a decade now. So there's a lot of interpretation papers and positions that are issued to the COSIR membership. Some of them reach the general public. So on the COSIR website, you will find quite a lot of my writings. But also, I've also published together or edited together with Gert Bos from QServe a book on software as a medical device with various authors addressing certain topics. That's obviously a very good starting point to cover the area. And I would say Google my name, and here and there you'll see that I am talking at a conference or providing a training. So that's what I would say people could relate to, or send me a link through LinkedIn and I'll tell you.
Excellent. Thank you very much.